Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the final session of this conference, Teaching Guilt, the History Wars and Education. I actually think this is the most important topic of the day, but then I'm biased. You can tell this is an important topic because it's come up in so many sessions already today. We've talked about decolonizing the curriculum, the role of the European Union in influencing what happens in schools, whether history teaching should be about engendering curiosity and interest in students about history, or transmitting facts and knowledge. Education as transferring the knowledge of the past to a new generation, whether university students think that history is not about facts but about power dynamics in the idea that everything that you might learn is a construct, and the idea that even Chaucer in UK universities now needs to come with a trigger warning. So education, it seems to me, has been a running theme throughout the day so far, and we can take advantage of this final session to really pull all of that together and look at how the history wars are playing out in our schools and universities. And to do that, I'm delighted that we have a truly international panel of experts in this area, so we can get a real taste for what's happening across schools and universities in different countries. So if I introduce people in the order in which they'll speak, we have Goran Adamson, who's an associate professor in sociology and an internationally renowned critic of multiculturalism and diversity from the University of Europe in Berlin. Next to him, we have Jorge Alvarez Palomino, a professor of contemporary history and political thought from CEU in San Pablo University in Madrid. Third, we have Ferenc Lacho, assistant professor of history at Maastricht University, but also Hungarian, so can give us both perspectives there. And finally, we have Miroslav Vanek, leading historian Czech, historian in contemporary Czech history and oral history, with a particular focus on the Velvet Revolution. So we're in very safe hands this afternoon for what should be an excellent discussion. Goran.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here and to be invited, and I'm humbled by the very good speeches by the previous speakers. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a few things, and I'm going to try to make just three simple points, talking about three simple, well, not simple, but three areas. And the first one is, what is going on in our schools and universities? The second one is, why is this happening? And then the third one is, what can we do about it? And this third point is probably the most important, surely, but maybe also the most difficult to engage in. And so what is going on? When I was a kid, when I was a young boy, we always took the car to the countryside up in the South Swedish highlands. And as we approached the cottage or the house, there was this very wide stone fence walls, I think they're called. Sometimes my father told me 8 meters wide and 1.5 and sometimes 2 meters high. And my father, he liked to point this out, so I haven't forgotten it. And he just told me briefly, you know what they did? They just dragged all these rocks here. And from the lands next to them to have a wall between the little road and the land they tried to cultivate. And it wasn't easy because Småland, as the place is called, it was not good for crops. But still they made it, and they managed to make a living there. And I thought a lot about these things. This was way before I had any political ideas in my mind. And to simplify things enormously, you could say that between 1850 and 1950, Sweden transformed from being possibly the poorest country in Europe to being the richest, one of the most prosperous at least. And my simple question to you is, should you be ashamed of this? Should you be embarrassed by it? Or should you be happy and delighted when you think about it? Maybe even have a self-esteem. Maybe you can even be proud about it. And this is, to you it might seem obvious, but I'm sorry to say that's not the case for everybody. One question to us in this panel is, but can we really educate the next generation if we cut them off from their roots? And I would love to say we can't. It's simply impossible, because it wouldn't be serious. But the problem is we can, and we have been doing it for many decades now. And I've been in the university, so I have first-hand knowledge about what's going on, in Sweden at least, and actually also in London. I've been teaching in London and other places. We are depriving our youth of their own memory, their own heritage, and their own self-understanding. They become strangers in their own eyes. And if you're a stranger in your own eyes, then you are surely the stranger in other people's eyes also. You are some kind of entity without a cultural identity. And I find that appalling, to put it mildly. What we are doing, or maybe not me personally, but the people who are in charge of this, is that they are creating man anew, or creating men and women anew, a new kind of human being. In our education, we take away memories, identities, roots, history from our children. And in its place, we insert, or you insert, something novel, something new. And we can insert anything we want, anything we feel. And you could say, maybe you don't need to say this is totalitarian, but you could at least say it is a kind of soft totalitarian remake of a culture, conducted in the sphere of education. The minds of the pupils and students, there are a lot of expressions for this. You can say we are creating a blank slate. You can say we are creating an empty canvas, and then you can start painting on that canvas. Anything you feel would fit, would be better than the history that they were brought up with, something new. Okay, but you could say that education is just a tiny fraction of society. Why is that so important? Is this really an effective way of transforming culture at large? Yes, it is, I think. If we listen to the words of the old Italian communist leader, Antonio Gramsci, he said, you can take everything if only you leave the field of education to us. We're fine with that, because he knew that if you have access to the field of education, the young generation coming, storming forth in the media and everywhere, you will probably win the game anyway. Of course, again, one shouldn't exaggerate, and previous speakers have, I think, successfully argued that there are at least a totalitarian tendency going on here. And Sweden is not a totalitarian state, and I don't think Europe has, reached that level. But I think the writing is on the wall, and the way that the entire university section, or the entire educational system in Europe, has been affected to such a degree by these tendencies to erase the past, or if not erase it, at least make us extremely embarrassed by it, has a totalitarian tendency, and I would argue that. So why is this happening? Why are these things going on in Europe? Of course, you can have many explanations, but I would like to suggest something that I find interesting here. Because the elites have shifted sides. The elites have shifted sides. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean this. Historically, elites used to be on the barricades of their country. They were on the barricades of their country, defending it with their teeth and their lives. Because if they didn't, their country would go away. It would vanish. They had to, because if not, the country would come apart. So that was the task of the elites, not so long ago. Now our elites have become multiculturalists, and you all know this, multiculturalist and globalist. Ideologically, they have changed foot. And this is I think this is a revolution, a quiet revolution, and not many people talk about it, but I think it's quite interesting. And they seem to care very little about their country. So little, the only thing they want us to teach our young generation is to be embarrassed by it, by our history, by our culture, by our identity. So, my last point. What can we do about this? And I've heard other speakers talk about this, and I agree with them. They say, they say we need to win back the field of education. We need to win back, our past. But the problem is we need to have some more concrete ideas about this. You know, we should go beyond just vain political hopes. We should try to address some concrete ideas. And it's not easy, of course. But first, one thing one shouldn't do. And one speaker, sadly I've forgotten who it was, but said something I think was quite clever. It is not about giving back. It is not about retaliating. And instead of having a left-wing leaning higher education or education system, it should be conservative or reactionary or anything else, or Catholic. That's not the recipe. The recipe is to move away from these entrenched, you know, tensions and aggressive attitudes and say, no, we should have an open discussion. We should have an open university. If people like Foucault, bring them on. Let's talk about this. And if I disagree with you, don't start name calling, you know, and attack my character. Let's talk about this openly. And I saw a very nice expression of this in the handout on the webpage for the conference. It was something like, we should insist that education is about a balanced understanding of our past. And I would like to sign that. I think that's exactly what we should aim for. Not to replace a left-leaning, self-hating attitude towards culture, towards our past, with this self-eulogizing, excessively optimistic, idealizing attitude. We should never do that, because that's doing exactly the same thing, just with reverse colors, with the coat inside out, as they say. We should move away from this to an open intellectual attitude, nothing more. Yeah. And teach and lecture, and there should be initiatives like this initiative, which is great. And also, final thing I'd like to say, we should carefully address the inconsistencies on part of the people who seem to hate our past and hate our culture. For instance, why do refugees migrate to Sweden and not away from Sweden? And the people who have tenured positions by saying that Sweden or Britain or France is a terrible place to be, why do they stay? Why don't they go to their culture of preference? They don't. Because I think there is a disconnection here between abstract rhetoric and the concrete reality in which they live. And to me, this is hypocrisy. And, you know, you should address these things and say, you need to live the way you speak. Yeah. So this is a battle worth taking, final sentence. This is a battle worth taking, because regaining the field of education is essentially about democracy, and it's about getting away from elitism, and it's about regaining the rule of the people. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Sorry. Go ahead. 10.5.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me, for allowing me to be here. A lot of great speakers have spoken before me, and some of them are going to do it after me. And frankly, I'm not going to explain better the things that we are living, the problems that we are facing than the way that they have done. So I will just try to do something more humble, which is talk to you about the vision from Spain. I'm from Madrid, and I would like to address this topic from the Spanish perspective, because I think that there are some things that we can all learn from what has been happening in Spain. You know, after all, we were the responsibles of the journey of Christopher Columbus, which is the beginning of the cruel history of Western imperialism and oppression worldwide, no? So the blame is on us. We know something about empires and colonial legacy. Actually, this has been something that Spain has to deal with for a lot of time. Let me tell you about what we call the Black Legend. I don't know if maybe some of you are familiar with the concept, some of you may not. It's an important idea on Spanish historiography. We call Black Legend to the construction on the 16th century of a negative view of Spain on everything that Spain has done in history. This is something that actually, there is nothing surprising in this, because it was mainly done by the enemies of the Spanish Empire at the moment, which is something that Europeans have been done, or we Europeans have spent centuries like putting the blame on the others and saying that we are all horrible, no? Because that's what Europeans do, no? Normally we fight. And so the English, the French, the Dutch, the enemies of the Spanish Empire, since the 16th century, create this very negative vision of Spain that we call Black Legend. Here in Brussels, no, we have a very clear example. If you go to the Grand Place, you will see that there is a plaque remembering in the Grand Place the leaders of the rebellion that were killed by the Spanish Empire in the 16th century, by the Duke of Alva and the oppression of the government of the Spanish Duke of Alva here in Belgium. So this has been going on for a lot of time. The Black Legend in Spain, therefore, it's something, my point is that Spain past has been contested and has been attacked probably before any other European nation. And like everything, in some points there is true in this attack, in other points there is exaggeration. But essentially, I think that there is something very innovative or interesting for us in this construction of the Black Legend, which is that there is a proto-anti-colonial speech here. When people start to attack Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries, they start to explain that what Spain is doing in America, it's essentially oppression. It's empire at its worst. Now, what is happening in America? That the conqueror, what we talk about Spanish America, the cruelty of the conquerors, Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, like cruel people that they only want gold, they go there to exploit the resources of the indigenous people, they killed indigenous people, and actually, what we call today, they commit a genocide in America, the mistreatment of the Indians. Probably if you think about your very iconic vision of the Spanish conquest of America, there is a lot of this going on, like conquerors, like bad people, like cruel people, exploitation, mistreatment of native original people, etc. This is something that has been there. What is the point? This was not accepted at the beginning in Spain. I mean, this was something that was explained in other countries to try to attack the Spanish Empire. In the same way that the Spanish, for example, we have been saying for centuries that France is a horrible country or that the British Empire was horrible because we were fighting, they were the enemies. The thing is, what is the effect that on the long term this negative idea has and how it is adopted by your own people? This is the problem, because the Black Legend was not very accepted between the Spanish population, but it has been very accepted in Latin America. The people living in what was the former Spanish Empire really accepted this idea and used it to legitimize the creation of new nations. The state building, the nation building in Latin America resides on this anti-colonial speech. And it goes up even until today, I don't know if you have seen this, but quite recently we have a diplomatic crisis between the Kingdom of Spain and Mexico because the new Mexican president, Claudia Sheinbaum, has put as a condition for the Spanish king, Felipe VI, to go to Mexico, that he has to apologize for the conquest of Mexico. And until the king do not apologize for the conquest of Mexico, he's not going to be allowed to enter or to go to Mexico. And this has opened a big diplomatic crisis. So this is things that we're still dealing with, and it has been always in the very complex relationship of Spain with its former empire, because the idea that the empire was inherently bad was there. So the point is, what happened when this is adopted by your own people? Because it is easy to understand why the recent republics, at the beginning of the 19th century in Spanish America, why did they embrace this speech of anti-colonial speech? Because they needed to create a separate identity from the Spanish one. When you create, Simón Bolívar, José de San Martín, when you are trying to create the new nations in the Spanish Empire, you have to find something that makes you different from the former nation. What is different between someone from Argentina or from Venezuela than someone from Spain? We speak the same language. We have the same religion. So what can we do? The point is, let's going to see that Spain has a bad history of oppression, and then we are going to find a mythical connection, not with the Spanish legacy, but with the indigenous people. This is why we have Claudia Sheinbaum, who obviously is not of a native Mexican tribe, reclaiming the rights of indigenous peoples in Mexico, because this is at the core of nation building. So my point is, obviously, these kind of speeches are always useful when we are trying to create identity if we want to divide. But why then in Spain right now, the black legend and this idea has been adapted by the same Spaniards, no? If you go to university today in Spain, if you go to school, the idea of Spanish history is going to be this one, fairly negative anti-colonial history. And this appears in the 1960s, 1970s, just like in the rest of Europe. So my question, which Goran already addressed a bit, and I think that we can discuss, it's, we understand why, for example, foreign nations try to attack your history. We understand why people who want to separate from a nation try to attack the history. But why the same people of a same nation attack their own history, What is really happening here? And I think this is the question, What are we trying to get with this? Probably the answer is a bit frightening, but we can address it in the debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the opportunity to participate today. I am here as a professional historian, a university lecturer, and also as an engaged citizen who has become increasingly concerned about the decline of history education and more broadly of historical consciousness in our societies. That is also to say that I happen to agree with a number of the more theoretical insights that Frank Furedi articulates in his new book, even if I find several of his more polemical passages somewhat one-sided. I actually think that the problem is even wider and deeper. I'm afraid that the often shameless political instrumentalization of the past and the passing of moralizing judgments through historical anachronisms that he discusses in such an illuminating fashion, they actually characterize the most varied intellectual and political forces these days, and not only those who may be chasing illusions of decolonization. And in such a context, we indeed need to have an urgent discussion concerning what are the legitimate forms of memory politics in a democratic society. That is, what forms can the mandate take that our institutions, and state institutions in particular, possess to try to reshape the way people remember the past? And most crucially, perhaps, the limits of that mandate. And I welcome the book precisely for highlighting those necessary limits. I must admit that I personally find somewhat less convincing the book's rather brief analysis of the historical profession and trends in history education, where the main focus seems to be on what I personally see as the rather peculiar case of the United Kingdom. But let me begin with some more general remarks. Our modern sense of history, that is, our sense of the past as a realm different from the present, which is worth studying seriously and worth studying professionally, it actually emerged in connection with the realization that we were leaving previous ages behind for good. The world is never going to be the same again. A favorite of TV commentators when reporting on what they consider historic moments is actually a perception that is quite fundamental to the experience of modernity. Now, humans in modern times therefore needed to study what came before them to understand things about the world of the ancestors that were no longer immediately comprehensible to them. And they also felt required to make special efforts to preserve the past because they realized that otherwise it would simply disappear. That is why I think that modernity and history may actually be considered two sides of the same coin. In other words, our historical consciousness may be understood as a crucial compensatory mechanism in a fast-changing world. In a sense, historical consciousness therefore presupposes a sense of change rather than continuity. It's, I think, a very important point. Now, having said all that, the study of history became so important in the 19th and 20th century, I would argue, because it could speak to the present. And it is therefore quite apt to think of historians as translators. Translating is, of course, always an imperfect exercise, an exercise where you try to be as faithful as possible while being inventive as well. And I think that is precisely what good historians do. Such historians do their best to try to be both accurate regarding all the details that they illuminate in their original contexts, as well as imaginative in their interpretations that they actually develop primarily for their contemporary readers, right? After all, the past is something that has already happened and is already past, and the concept of history refers to what we are living in. To my mind, what makes the intellectual contribution of historians therefore truly special is not only that they are open to words that are different from their own, and not only their nuanced understanding of various perspectives or different contexts, not even just their fine sense of proportions and balance, but perhaps most crucially, the fact that they provide original analyses of rather complex processes by thinking about the layers of time and the rhythms of change. So it seems crucial to me to add that at the dawn of modernity, when you go back, let's say, 200 years, our world appeared diverse. Spaces often felt vast, and the time of specific places would strike people as really deep. And to many people, it therefore made a lot of sense to try to account for how specific places, such as countries, have come to be shaped by drawing long lines of continuity across the centuries, while they were also limiting their spatial horizons, right? Their accounts had limited horizons in that respect. And I would argue that something quite fundamental changed in our own times. And perhaps the easiest way to grasp that change is by referring to the consciousness of somebody who is growing up today in the age of the World Wide Web. They will know that they can connect to practically anyone else immediately, no matter where that person may be on the planet. It is a consciousness that is defined by the experience of the World Wide Web, where location seems to matter rather little, and the sense of time also becomes much shallower through that prevalent sense of immediacy, right? And in such an age, the teaching of history is bound to prove highly challenging, even if we now disregard all the pressures of memory politics, whether in legitimate or illegitimate forms. But I should quickly add, though, that I do not think of the teaching of history as a kind of modern substitute for moral or emotional education. I certainly do not think of myself as a preacher, nor am I a psychologist. To my mind, history as a subject is not there in the curriculum to foster pride or to induce shame. And I doubt that many of my colleagues who teach history think of their job in those terms. Our task, our proper task as historians, is to historicize. That is to say, to approach and represent important aspects of the past as parts of history. And historicization, I would argue, is always a critical exercise. We teach young people not in order to make them identify with historical actors or to reject them for that matter. We teach them to make them comprehend the how and the why of change over time and the role of legacies. Ultimately, we wish to help young people become more aware and more self-reflexive about their own historically embedded subjectivities and how those subjectivities have come to be formed. It is also true, as Donald Bloxham has shown, I think in really impressive detail, that it is hardly possible to write history without recourse to value judgments and hence to moral notions. To me, that implies that even though what history educators offer is not the same as moral education, they would be well advised to articulate and be ready to discuss with their students the bases of those judgments. So if history teachers accomplish that key analytical goal of historicization, while also reflecting on what I consider to be the less important, but also quite unavoidable moral components of their interpretations, I think that history education can truly play an essential role in the training of young people to be conscious and responsible citizens, and such an education may indeed be more essential now than ever, now that young people's consciousness is so strongly shaped by the internet, with its tendency to reduce their sense of space and their sense of time. I would like to thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to thanks to MCC that they invited me and cover my trip, not only my, but our colleague, and it's excellent to be here. I would like to bring something from the Czech space and tell you something about the battles over the past in Czech running last 80 years. And I think that these battles are not only on the present, but more precisely on the future. Exactly according to George Orwell novel 1984, which was mentioned here, just repeated: who controls the past controls the future, who controls the present controls the past. I think that me and maybe my colleague were very naive that the battle over the past finished with the 1989 year. I would like to bring some paradoxes in the fight for the past after 1989. It was mentioned here, the problem under the communism, but what was after? There is the interesting conflict between the right-wing anti-communist and European pressures. Today's Czech liberal government is broadly pro-European, but still grounded in the anti-communism of the 90s. The second point, there is another paradox. It's a generational conflict between the right-wing anti-communist, age 55 plus, and the current progressive generation. I think that both approaches tend to limit freedom, though they differ in their views on the past. Young progressives see the past more from a revisionist than a totalitarian perspective. The third point, we are still at war against communism, but the war has changed. We don't want to believe that globalization can bring again attempts to revise our history. Something about anti-communist wars in education. In 2017, the Czech Security Service, BIS, published an annual report which said, quotation, "Modern history taught in schools is in effect a Soviet version of history which supports Soviet propaganda." It was from 2017, not 1997, for example. This statement shocked teachers, textbook authors, and curriculum designers, and it led to a meeting between the Minister of Education and BIS chief. Of course, no evidence of pro-Soviet bias was found, but the teacher received a signal that the state is again interested in what and how they teach. In this context, there are still disputes about the textbook that described 40 years of socialism, with the question of whether we as individuals can be proud of this period and whether new generation could be proud of their parents. But these questions are not historical questions, but moral ones. In these days, we saw that progressive topics coming into Czech schools heavily and brings the new battles primarily occur within preparing the framework educational plans, FEP. The most controversial part of the new curricula is a passage in the chapter Understanding the Past, which states that, quotation, "Students should understand that social and gender order are constructed and enforced by authorities, and those who deviate may face persecution and discrimination. Efforts toward emancipation, for example, women's struggle for political and social rights, the equal rights of LGBTQ+ arguments, communities in family law have been and are being blocked by historical arguments that refer to traditionally understood unchanging roles. This passage criticizes a lot of historians, include the Prime Minister, the Czech Bishop Conference, and many experts, and now is under review. I think something about the European influence on history education in Czech Republic. The new curricula draw heavily from a European Parliament report. The Article 14, the path to an informed historical consciousness in Europe declares, quotation, chauvinism, gender stereotypes, and power asymmetries are deeply rooted in European history. Submission to the European approach can be also seen in the creators of Czech curricula. There is a recommendation to the teachers, quotation, suppress their own opinions during the instruction, even if they believe, for example, that there are only two genders, male and female, they must present this neutrally to the students. If we applied such recommendation before 1989 and teaching on topics, for example, Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, it's clear that at least 90% of teachers at that time indeed suppressed their views on the official narrative, which they disagreed. Teachers who conformed to the official narrative at that time are now criticized as opportunist and conformist. There are some 2 points that are quite crucial for the Czech education, and it's changes in historical education. The first one is the new curricula reduce political factual knowledge, like rulers and battle dates, in favor of culture and civilization events. While this approach could make sense, the lack of emphasis of chronology is problematic. Instead, students are introduced to 13 phenomena and trends across history, such as conflicts, colonialism, decolonization, and gender laws, including LGBTQ issues. The second point, the ministry also proposed reducing national history in favor of world history and European history. This shift, focusing more on global themes such as environmentalism and gender, could weaken students' culture identity. The conclusion, the battles over the past in Czech Republic are ideological conflicts about how the present and future society should be shaped. Different political groups and interested groups are competing to dominate the narrative of history, not only in the public sphere, but also in the education system, where the goal is to influence the thinking of the next generation. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, we will come out to the floor. I'm sure people have got lots to say on what they've heard, but I'm particularly keen to hear from students, who I know we've got in the audience today, teachers, lecturers, about what's actually going on in the classroom, what's actually going on in the lecture theatre, how is history being taught. And just to kick us off on that very briefly, I'd just like to outline, just for 1 minute, what's going on in English schools right now, as far as I understand it. It seems to me that the idea of teaching a national history has really been under attack for, well, really since the middle of the last century. So for about 60, 70 years now, the idea that you teach a chronological national story has been going out of fashion. And that first was replaced by a focus on skills, that rather than learning a story, students were expected to learn the skills of being a historian. And first and foremost amongst those skills, very quickly seemed to arise, was the skill of empathy, of being able to sympathize emotionally with people who've been in different historical circumstances. So certainly when my children were at school, learning about the Second World War meant dressing up as an evacuee and carrying a little lunchbox and another box to signify your gas mask, and you'd empathize with what it was like to be sent away from home. Another lesson would be to crouch down on the floor with all your friends underneath the table, stay there for a very long time, and have had an experience of what it was like to have been in a slave ship traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. This was all criticised by Michael Gove, who became our education secretary about 10 years ago, who introduced a new curriculum, which has been criticised by many teachers for being very content heavy, for having lots of facts and being too demanding for children. But even though we've got that curriculum and that context, we still don't have, I don't think, a coherent national story. History is taught very much in topics. So children might study medicine one term, or China in another term, or food in another term. So this is not chronology, this is not a national story, this is kind of quite a random approach to teaching children about the past. We have 80% of our teachers in the past, history teachers, in the past 2 or 3 years, saying that they've changed their curriculum quite deliberately to introduce a greater focus on diversity. So what this means is that even though topics like the Tudors will still be taught, children learn about Black Tudors, the Black experience in Tudor England, which I'm not a historian, but I do know was be a very, very tiny minority experience of the grand totality of what was happening during the Tudor period. So I'm very keen to hear from you. I'm really provoked by the suggestion that Ferenc made that the UK is somehow a peculiar case, that what we are doing in our history lessons is perhaps unusual. So I'm very keen to hear from, like I say, anybody who has comments that they'd like to make in relation to history teaching, but particularly students, teachers, lecturers. Stick your hand up, please, and we'll make sure the microphones come round. And so if we could have a microphone right at the back, please.
Ashley Frawley, MCC Brussels Research Fellow. Yeah, I was just going to say, I grew up in Canada, which is sort of like one of the levels of hell from which a lot of this stuff emanates. And I definitely, so I'm in my 30s, but this stuff kind of really speaks to me in how I was educated when I was a child. It's all very experiential, and we all learned to sort of self-flagellate over all the things that happened to the Indigenous people, that sort of thing. And it wasn't until I started my PhD, 16 years ago or whatever, I realized that my knowledge of history was really spotty. And it was when I came to the UK and I was talking to other people and I got a little bit embarrassed and I hit the books hard. But I realized too that if I had not, started an education in a different country that hadn't yet been affected quite so deeply, I might have stayed with that level of knowledge. And a lot of my friends went into teaching and they became teachers. So if you try to introduce a change and go content heavy, I can imagine if that were to happen in Canada, my friends would probably push back against it because they don't have the knowledge to teach that content. So it strikes me that this happens with a lot of things, like with reading. So they tried to, the sort of reading wars, that sort of thing. So there was this whole language approach where they stopped teaching phonics because they thought it it killed the joy of reading, that sort of thing. So a ton of kids were not learning how to read because they were taught to read English like it was Chinese, just to recognize the shape of the word. And my brother went through that. He still can't read to this day. But what happened was when they tried to reintroduce phonics, the knowledge of how to teach it was gone. And so a lot of the teachers, even now in Canada, they push back against it. And I look at my nieces who are in the Canadian system, and they're still taught kind of a whole language approach because it's such a slow turn. So it's not as easy as just being like, oh, we need to sort of go back to such and such. You have to realize how deep, when you have a whole regime change in an education system that has its octopus tentacles so far out, it's not as easy as saying, let's go back to content. You lose something. So this is why it's so important in countries that haven't, been affected by this yet, how much you have to push back against watering down the curriculum, because it has a tail, that lasts a really, really long time, because you just lose the knowledge and you lose the ability to teach it for decades.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's really important to remember that teachers are a product of culture just as much as they're producing it. Frank, please, and then Katalin behind.
Yeah, so just on that point, 15 years ago, in my department, my sociology department, we realized that the cohort of undergraduates coming in didn't know the difference between a traditional society and a modern society, and couldn't make a distinction between an industrial society and an agricultural one. Something that, in my days, 12-year-olds would know inside out. So what we did was we put in a year-long history prep course for social science students who basically knew nothing about the past. Now, I think that this problem is not an Anglo-American problem. It's very strong there. I think it's similar in the Portuguese, Spanish world. I think that many of the things that I discuss in my book are just as strong in Sweden as it is in England. So I think that Ferry's point about an Anglo-American thing is just factually wrong. Belgium being a very good example, the number of countries that have a very similar orientation towards history is large in the Western context. But I just want to raise something else that hasn't been discussed. I think that in the whole course of history teaching, it is quite important that we try to have a history curriculum that is open-ended and is prepared to yield to new experience. So I'm totally against there being one history curriculum. And I'm totally against state intervention in the teaching of history, because invariably that will lead to the politicization of the curriculum, even with the best of intentions. And I know that history teaching is always instrumentalized, always been instrumentalized, but to me the important thing is this. I don't mind if I learn a particular kind of history that's ideological, as long as I'm also given some facts. Because I think that smart students can always rebel against the curriculum. And that's what's happened for generations and generations. You get handed down this one-sided view of the world, but students can rebel against that. What I'm against is when history becomes totally moralized, as is the case at the moment, where it becomes totally independent of anything that's rooted in any kind of historiographical accomplishment. So I think that, to me, is really crucially important. And I think what is also important in the teaching of history, and this is really why this subject is so important, is that we've got to be aware of the fact that almost everything that young people learn about the past comes not from schools, but it comes from Netflix. It comes from all these other cultural institutions who have really bought into the kind of history that the kind of past that I criticize, and which then becomes internalized into the curriculum. I think the New York Times' project on history is really paradigmatical in this respect, because the New York Times story was taken up by movies and they got a Pulitzer Prize and everything else, and it then becomes almost like a taken for granted issue. So when we're talking about history teaching, we've got to bear in mind that there's a cultural landscape out there, which is probably a bigger problem than anything else that happens within the schools.
Thank you. Katalin, just behind you. Thank you.
I have a question to Miroslav. Miroslav, you have been a very important person in developing the academic discipline of oral history in post-89 Czechoslovakia and 93 Czech Republic. But oral history mostly focused on the dissident's perspective, of the previous regime's opponent's perspective, and the victim's perspective. My question is, how much emphasis did you have in oral history also to give the voice for the perpetrators, and whether you did political support to do it?
Yeah. Sorry, can we get the microphone to the side over there?
Thank you very much. I mean, you have talked about wokeism a lot, of course, kind of these attacks on history and the related guilt, which is coming from the left. But I really had to think about the things we witnessed in Poland under the last government, where also historians who are interested in the history of the Polish assistants in the Holocaust, for example, were kind of attacked both physically as well as just by the media from the former government. So obviously we see that there's also this kind of risk. So I was wondering, maybe for Professor Alvarez, how as patriots who want to kind of have a good view of our country and our history, we do not, how can we not fall in this pitfall of nationalism where we only deify our history? How can we actually relate with colonialism in a way which makes sense between these two extremes? Thank you.
We'll take one more, then we'll come back to the panel. Excuse me, yes, sorry, yeah, there, thank you very much.
I want to thank all of you for the different contributions and facts that you have told us. And my question would be, after this good diagnosis, what would be your, your initiative or your suggestions for a change in the teaching of history? I'm worried about that. I've been thinking to introduce some subjects about sources and something like that, but I would like to hear your views. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we go in reverse order this time? Miroslav, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, I can start. I have a lot of notes here. I very agree with the Frank that he said that curriculum need to be open-ended. It's what we need for every countries. I have to say that because we have an interrupted history, which I live, and I see that it's another slogan that winners write a history. I have to agree, because we are focused on the winners and maybe less on the losers on another side. And I can join with the Catalin question about the oral history. I have to say that I am not advocate oral history only because I prefer that we put together all the sources, but after '89 we need to focus on the people who are not who were not the possibility to tell something, and because we're in this center, etc. It's why we did the interview with them, and there will be the silence groups which didn't get any chance up to this time, for example. So I have to say that there is the big clash, for example, in oral history, that maybe before I have to say that I quite divorced with the International Oral History Society, because it seemed me that they now more use the oral history for activism and this one, and I am quite. I see the academic attempt to do history. So without the archive sources and etc., I can do the good research. So.
And come back next time if that's
okay. Come back. Just that, for example, it was a problem after the '89 that we did a lot of interview. I did a biographical interview with the more than 700 persons, and there were the people like, for example, former resident and former President Václav Havel on one side. On the other side, it was the last General Secretary of Communist Party, Miloš Jakeš. On the other side were the workers from the miners, and etc. And it was the problem to ask for the interview the people from protagonists from communist regime, because the colleague told me how you can ask these people, how you can meet these people. I think because I am historian, I need to know about our past from their point of view, not like I lived in. It's all.
Thank you very much. Ferenc.
Thank you
So much for the comments and also the questions, really excellent ones. Perhaps I should go back straight away to the UK-related comment, which I suppose triggered a number of irritations. My point, and it's certainly true that I didn't explain myself very well, my point was that I think the subject of history is a much more polarizing one in the UK than, for example, in the Netherlands or Germany. Now, of course, you could look at a whole variety of reasons why that is. Of course, the history of empire, all the divisions that followed with the debate around Brexit and so on, and simply the two-party system that is in place. You know, I happen to come from a country which is a neighboring one to this one, where I think we have 16 parties in parliament. I don't think we had, and I forgot to count, maybe it's even more by now, I don't think we had a national government with fewer than 4 parties in the past 15 years or so. And that is to say that history is not going to be particularly polarizing when you need to build large coalitions with many different forces. So I think in that sense, the UK is actually somewhat different from what is often the continental model, let's say Germany, the Netherlands, and some other countries. Again, Hungary is probably more similar to the UK in this respect, but that's maybe we can discuss after the session. But let me maybe get to the question about the practical suggestion, because that might be more important to go into. You know, I happen to have studied history in a Hungarian high school, one of the best ones in Budapest, I should say. I'm a very proud graduate of my high school. And then I studied in the Netherlands. And of course, I was very struck by how different the two educational systems are and how differently history is actually taught, right? And I asked my colleagues, you know, when I was an undergraduate, what they learned about the origins of the First World War, right? One of the most studied and divisive subjects in modern historiography. And they said, well, we were asked to write an essay after we looked up a number of documents and sources and explain why we think it broke out. And then I went back to my Hungarian textbook and looked up what was there. And what I found, at that time I was around 20 years old, right? What I found, and this really struck me, was an extremely heavy and extremely professional historiographic discussion about the structural causes, the short-term causes, the ironic, you know, narrative that nobody quite knew where it was going, and all of that. It was an extremely sophisticated 3-page summary, which I, as a 17-year-old, obviously didn't understand at all. And here comes my main point. That's when I understood that you need to actually combine these two things, right? You need to ask people, okay, so based on what you've read, what do you think about it? Which in the Hungarian system at that time wasn't asked. But you also need that dense professional explanation from experts, which maybe is not provided enough in the Netherlands, right? So that would be my suggestion.
Thank you. Jorge and Goran, could we perhaps move on and address this idea of state intervention into the curriculum, whether you could have a national curriculum that could put everything magically right for us, or anything else you want to talk about? Jorge.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think there are and touching on the questions about what can we do to reform and how do we deal with nationalism, imperialism, like the danger or the temptation to whitewash or pinkwash or history. I think that very good ideas have already appeared here. I will try to say something. Professor Goldman, for example, said that the importance is history is to trade the facts and look for the truth. And this is the role of historians. Ferenc also explained this. Historians should be interested in the past in itself and not in the uses of the past. But I know it's inevitable that we are going to be biased by something, and this is always going to happen. So how can we counterbalance the inherent bias on teaching history, whether it is a self-loathing bias or a nationalistic bias? I think that with debate and open questions. I think that how do we teach history to try to avoid that? Read diverse sources. Do not read only guys that support what you think. Read the others. Do not only engage in discussion with people who are going to agree with you. Try to invite people who think different. This is what it's absolutely not happening today. Because what woke history tries is to avoid debate. Nobody can discuss anything, because there is only one single version. I think that an interesting point is to have an anti-colonial historian speaking about the evil of empire, and have someone who is going to speak about the good parts of empire, and then we have this kind of debate. So I think that that's the answer. And very briefly, state intervention, I think it's interesting. The case of Spain may be like what you call UK case, because we have strong parties, not coalitions normally. In concrete, for example, the Socialist Party in Spain is super strong and has a lot of influence on the curriculum. And I think that the effect it's been very bad. I think I'm with Professor Furedi. I think that we should try to avoid single national state-sponsored curriculums, because then we're going to always end in party stories, no? And when the government changes, then history changes, no? And there is no point in being explaining history according to the party who is ruling.
Thank you. And Cora?
First, I'd like to continue what Jorge is talking about. I think the lady in the back mentioned this. What kind of change would you suggest? How should we change, history teaching? And, social science, broadly speaking. And because I've been used with the idea that we should, when you talk about minority cultures, you should cherish minority cultures. You should foster it, you should celebrate it, all these words. And I never figured out what's the point in that. Clearly, there are good sides in minority cultures and minority groups, and then we should support it. But we have no bloody obligation to cherish anything. So I just turn it around and I tell my students, okay, so we're supposed to cherish Swedish history. And nobody wants to do that, of course, because they are trained and taught not to be nationalist, whatever that is. And I ask them, why not? Because this is exactly what you're doing in reverse colors. So just to elaborate on what you were suggesting, we should get out of that mess of celebrating or, fostering, be happy about things. This is an empirical question I tell my students. We need to know what this is about. And you can bring in National Socialism. Are we supposed to cherish National Socialism? No, and they realize it. You need to bring up these very hot cases, then they understand what's going on. We have no obligation to do any of that. So that's one thing I'd like to mention. And then another thing I say to my students often, because this relates to the whole, idea of not only, feeling embarrassed about your own past, but the other side of that coin, namely to cherish precisely exotic cultures. Exotic people from overseas, as we say. And I tell my students, okay, we can do that. We can cherish minority cultures. We can think that minority cultures is a wonderful thing. And we can ignore, working class guys who are probably the most disadvantaged, as we were talking about before. But then I tell my students, okay, but if you do that, you need to realize that you do this at a cost, because you are actually favoring a minority, and I'm a minority. I mean, if you talk about a democracy must cater for the majority. That's the point of a democracy. And if you don't care about the democracy, if you don't care about working class boys, this is dangerous, because you might actually almost be in favor of some kind of elitist systems, even some kind of dictatorship. And the funny thing is that when I listen to my students, when I bring this up, it's like they are in a state of shock. And it seems to me that for so long, they have not been taught and remembered that democracy has to cater for working class people, Yes, yeah. I think this is like pretty shocking, but it proves the point, I think. Yeah.
Let's have some response to that, please. Yeah, Robert? Oh, sorry, just wait for the microphone.
Well, it's not responsive. Another question. I always did think, I admit, that this was largely an Anglophone country problem. And Frank says it's not. And we've heard that there are varieties of this historiographical dilemma, whatever you want to call it, across Europe. But what I'd like to know is, what is it that Swedish children are taught to be ashamed of? Because I can see what British children are taught to be ashamed of. I can't imagine what Swedish children are taught to be ashamed of. Be serious.
It's a very good question,
okay,
and we can have answers as well as questions. Could we go to, just carry on to a bit further to the back here, please, over on your right?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, it perhaps complicates matters, but it's a British question to a European audience. Is this not a problem in other subjects as well? Because in some ways, it's come to history in Britain rather late. My children weren't taught geography at school. They were taught a species of ideology, which certainly made them shameful that they came from a rich country. English literature used to be the queen of our humanities disciplines in British universities when I started as a student. But nobody any longer respects English literature in British universities, or indeed A-level English in our schools, because it's been denuded of content and, of course, also ideologized. And along with that has gone a technical decline in our ability to speak foreign languages. Thank you for holding this conference in English, but I mean, that's always been something about the English. And so I've discovered that actually this is a problem across the humanities in general in our schools and in our universities. But that opens up opportunities as well, because we need not sit here totally depressed because history seems to be declining before our eyes. I've made links with lots of people in other disciplines recently who also feel the same. Certainly in Britain, this is a problem across the humanities, and that opens up alliances that we should all try to make.
Thank you. And let's go over to the left, please. My left, sorry, you're right. Yeah, there. Yep. No, okay.
Hello, yeah, just one of the things what you were saying against a national curriculum, so I'm from Canada as well, and I grew up in a different school system. But one of the things I think when we teach history, it's how to think and not what to think. And we should teach using sources. Because I remember I started studying in Canada and I came to Germany, and all of a sudden you used sources and not textbooks. And we have to get away from this textbook culture again and start using primary sources and let people make up their own mind and avoid this whole curriculum, national curriculum business, but get your nose in the sources and learn how to use sources, also oral history. Thank you.
Sorry, whilst you still have a microphone, can I just ask you, what age are you talking about? I mean, do you think even secondary school children should be
I'm talking about the university level.
University.
I'm past secondary.
Thank you. Sorry, and carry on this side, please, just in front here. Yeah, gentleman in front. Yeah, thank you.
Firstly, I'd like to say that history is an exact science. Exact. So it's a very dangerous science, and that's the reason also why it's being influenced and used as a weapon. What the book is all about, how to change history to influence people. But I'm a museum guide, and I guide sometimes, and I'm always astonished how you can make young people interested by just touching the right, let's say in English, core. Thank you very much. Core. And if you see their interest, and I gave a tour in the Army Museum 2 years ago, there were some people from Syria who were part of the students, and I was very astonished by their questions. And you should make people ask questions, make them curious, make them interested. That's all I want to say. Thank you.
And could we go to Jacob right at the back there, please?
Yeah, thanks. Jacob Reynolds, MCC Brussels. I find myself kind of conflicted on this question of the national curriculum, because I think it was one thing to say that the kind of danger of the state being involved in setting a curriculum and turning the curriculum into a political football every time the government changes, etc., etc. It was one thing to make that argument when you could kind of broadly count on the fact that different educational institutions, different curriculums that would be produced by different organizations and enrolled in different schools, etc., we're all working off kind of the same basic shared assumptions about what you should know if you grow up in a particular country. And I don't think we live in that world now at all. So many of those assumptions have been completely thrown out of the window, where we can't count on the fact that well-intentioned people coming up with their own curriculums would arrive at something that might still broadly make sure that people in a country all had the shared kind of same reference points. And so I think we do need to have a bit of a discussion about what should be the non-negotiable parts of a curriculum, be it a literature curriculum or a history curriculum, that we are going to say that we will fight for. We will insist that they're part of the curriculum, and we will do what is necessary to win those battles, to make sure that if a government changes, we kind of hold their feet to the fire and keep those core parts. Because what we're faced with is a really, really deep question, which is that nobody has an answer to at the moment, which is, what is it about being French or British or Dutch or Spanish that we kind of want to pass on and transmit? And in the absence of an answer to that question, which can only begin by asking the question, what do we teach our children? If we don't have an answer to that question, then the further fragmentation and the kind of door is open to all of these political interventions in education. I think we have to hold the line, and I'm more in favour of a national curriculum than maybe some of my colleagues.
Could you pass the microphone just in front of you? Thank you.
Hi. One issue I wanted to raise is a more subtle change which I noticed when I was studying history for my bachelor's, which is the gradual disappearance of survey history, of the teaching of the chronological sequence of events in history. This happened and that happened and that happened, and that's how we're here now. And in favor of what I would describe as a more kind of an atomized teaching of history, which is where students seem to be dumped into very random niche areas of history with no, it's either assumed they know the background, or I don't know what people think these students are going to do. One example I can think of this myself was in my own university. There was a course given on gender in interwar China, which I think might have been perfectly an interesting course to do, but that was actually the only course taught of Chinese history in my university. Other students would not have learned about the sequence of Chinese 20th century history. They wouldn't have learned about the Qing Empire, then Sun Yat-sen, then Chiang Kai-shek, and then Mao Zedong. They were just dumped into warlord China and expected to learn about what life was like to be a woman in World War China with no relation to anything else.
It's a little niche.
Just as a broader question, I wonder to what degree is this promotion of atomized chronological history contributing to the decline of teaching of history?
Thank you. And could you take the microphone just over to the other side there, please? Gentleman there, thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. Tony Gillen from MCC Brussels. I think the point that Lawrence Goldman made before about politicisation of education is a really important one. And the very first job or task I had to do when I joined MCC Brussels was to proofread a report on the politicisation of history education in Europe, authored by no one else but Joanna Williams, who's chairing this session. And I seem to remember that report detailed rather well what Frank spoke about this morning with regards to the use of history to promote present-day concerns about sustainability and gender fluidity across various European countries in some detail. I seem to remember. So perhaps, Joanna, you might be able to abuse your role as chair briefly and say something about that. And then just very quickly, I'm not sure I agree with Jacob. I haven't quite worked out my mind on that one. Maybe it has to come from culture and it can't come from central government. But when my 18-year-old daughter's boyfriend was about to come to Brussels the first time, and I said, I must take you to Waterloo. And he said, why? I said, so you can see where the Battle of Waterloo took place. And he said, what? And I said, do you know the Battle of Waterloo? And he said, never heard of it. And I said, well, started to explain it, so I had to refer to Napoleon. And he said, who? And I said, well, you know, Napoleon after the French Revolution. He said, what? And so I guess my question there is whether history teaching should be compulsory to a certain age. In the UK, it's only until 14. Only until 14. But if history teaching is all about teaching the values of the present that the elite want to shove down ordinary people's throats, perhaps it shouldn't be taught at all.
Thank you very much.
What do you think?
It's good to see that the spirit of debate is alive and well within MCC. There was a hand right at the very back there. Can you see the person with their hand up there? Thank you.
Hello, Tatiana Hashimi, anthropologist. I just have a short question. Do you see any difference in the relationship to history between the Western the West and the Eastern Europe?
Good question, thank you. And we've got one more, two more down here, and then we'll go back to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Could you reflect a bit more on the mythology and the role maybe of mythology in historical teaching? I mean, if I remember my primary school or high school, I would remember most of the historical data through some interesting mythological stories. So I feel that nowadays, historical teaching has been rationalized a lot. So what do you think, whether it would enhance our knowledge about history?
Good question. And just in front, if you could pass the microphone just in front of you. Thank you.
Cheers. I want to talk about the elephants in the room, the ones who have not been mentioned. We're talking about teaching, we're talking about curriculum, but turns out it's done by human beings, whom we used to refer to as teachers and lecturers, and they're not neutral. I had a piece out last week repeating Neil Ferguson's claim that in the social sciences, especially in humanities, 90 to 95% of people identify as socialists or worse. That doesn't change when you change your curriculum. It's a religion, it comes with a set of values, and history plays an important part in it. We're now back to a presentist interpretation of history, which we as history professionals were taught never to do. But clearly, that's also gone out the window. So you can't just change overnight a whole group of people who have particular ideas about what the world looks like and how it should be taught. How are we going to deal with that? Any suggestions?
Thank you.
That's all.
Any one tiny final question? Yeah, right at the very, very back there. Just wait for the mic.
Concerning national and European history. I was born in former Czechoslovakia, but in East Slovakia, in the Hungarian community. However, I have common past with the professor and common past with the lady. But how can we explain the same historical facts that happened to us? There is three narratives. One Hungarian, one Slovak, and one Czech. So that's why, if we are choosing only for a national curriculum, it will be not complete. I think, I'm a historian myself, so I finished here in Brussels, Université Libre de Bruxelles. Well, I finished Assyriology, so this is something else, but however. So we need something that there is a common, let's say a common European history, as well for member states, some national curriculum, but which is not opposite with, and is not in conflict with each other. So thank you, that's it.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll come back to our panel. I'm afraid you've just got 2 minutes each, and these are your concluding remarks. There's an awful lot to get through. You're not going to be able to answer everything. I'm particularly keen to know what it is Swedish people have to be ashamed of. And also what it is that we want to pass on, whether history should be addressing present-day concerns or right. Just concerned with the past. Go on.
Right, that's a very good question, but I have a very good answer, actually. Swedish children, Swedish children, Swedish people, we should be ashamed of, and I just listed a few points here, the way men treat women, and the way Swedish people treat migrants, and the way we treat the environment. We treat the environment terribly poorly, and the way we treat homosexuals is appalling. And you can all understand that this is not quite true. But that doesn't really matter at all. The point is that we are, flogging our own backs, and that's a good feeling. And this is what's going on. It doesn't have to be true. It really doesn't have to be true, as long as it fits the narrative of harassing yourself. But it also leads over to the elephant in the room, namely that, for instance, if you take Swedish radio, I think it's like 2% vote for the Green Party in Sweden. But in the Swedish radio, I think they are 56% or something. And then they say, well, we are professional. but they are not professional. So these are like two factors contributing to the thing. It is not about historical facts. It's not about what's true or not. It needs to fit into the narrative of self-harassment. I'm sorry, that's, pretty much it.
Thank you very much. Ferenc. Oh, sorry, Jorge.
Okay, I think, let's be honest, when we talk about how do we teach history, first of all, most of the people don't care about history. So when we teach history at a school level, I think that we have to try to give the basic knowledge, but most of the students are going to forget everything that they have been told in school, and they're not going to care about it never in their life. So I think that we have to try to do a pretty good job, but we're not going to solve anything there. Actually, I think that Professor Furedi made a good point. The idea of a history that is going to be important is the one that appears in cinema, or in TV series, or in comics, or in any other popular sources. Because the people are not going to pay attention to this history teacher in the school. Even me, I am a historian, and I did not pay attention in school to my history teacher. So I think that I think that the point here is that we have to create like a basic curriculum so people are not absolutely ignorant. No, the point of at least try to know who was Napoleon and what is Waterloo. Maybe it's way more complicated, no? But at least Napoleon. And over this, then we can build. However, teaching history and studying history is important, okay? Because I think that a lot of us are historians, no? And I'm not trying to say that we are useless. I think that it is important because this popular idea of history that really is the one that reaches most of the population, it is not just born out of nothing. It is born from the professional study of history. The idea is which kind of history is going to reach the producers of series and cinema. This is the point that really should concern us, no? So who is going to inform Hollywood about which history has to appear in the films? And here is where I think that we should have debate and we should have a struggle. But right now, there is only one channel. And there is only one history which is feeding all the popular content about history. And it is not so much about the schools. It is about this other channel, the channel of popular history. As long as Netflix and Hollywood only teach one kind of history, there is nothing that we can do at a school, at university, at foundations, or whatever. This is the point, this is the battleground, and I think that, for my conclusion remark, the battle is there. How do we reach the people on a popular basis, on the things that they really care about?
Thank you. Ferenc?
Thank you so much. I can't possibly address all the questions within 2 minutes, so let me perhaps focus on the good news. And I think there is substantial good news. Furedi writes in the book about the ahistorical nature of many of the social sciences, and I think that's a very, very good point. I happen to teach in European studies, and for the longest time I've been quite frustrated with the fact that international relations, political science, and so on are very ahistorical. They're very theoretical. They are very much into methodologies, complex ways of doing things, but they have no sense of history, and it's very difficult to cooperate in that way. But something has really changed, I think, in 2022 with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. People, especially in Western Europe, have realized that, well, we don't live in a post-historical world at all, that's for sure. Of course, I laugh at the diagnosis because I don't think we have ever exited history at all to begin with. But there is a very strong recognition that actually Eastern Europeans might have something valuable to add to the European discussion. And perhaps the shortest way to summarize that is the argument of Jaroslav Kuisz, the Polish thinker, who has written that, in Western Europe there was an idea that this is an event. And the Eastern Europeans thought, no, this is a long-term process that is playing out. It's basically the history of Russian imperialism, which started sometimes in the 18th century. And if you want to understand what's going on today, you have to study basically the past several centuries. And this is something that I think is filtering through, and therefore historical knowledge is becoming much more important, even in European studies, which I think for the longest time, again, were shaped not to be particularly interested in the past.
Thank you. Miroslav?
Yeah, it's a lot of remarks and comments and questions. I try to find for myself some result from it, and I think that it's for us like historians, and not only historians, but teachers. It's to find a balance. I think that we need to find a balance between the sources and using the sources like man from Canada, colleague from Canada thought, but we need to find a balance between the national and European world history. I think that it's a natural to start with the, it's my opinion, to start with the national history because it's similar to kids, to the children. It's like the children grew up and getting the first information from the grandparents and parents, and they could understand because it's their surrounding. I think that it's a similar one with the students, university students, and you need to get the facts, and then you can go over and for example, to find the content, the European history together with the national history. It's my opinion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we thank the panel, please, and thank you to the audience for all your questions.
I'm supposed to sum up, but I'll abuse my position. A number of things. I want to deal with the practical side of things. But just before that, I got one observation on the last panel which occurred to me. And given the fact there's a lot of Hungarians here, I thought I would give you my experience as a person that's lived in the West almost all their lives. History teaching in the West often assumes the form of playing with history. And that's what all these little modules do. When you basically are given a little module, like medical history in the 19th century, or as somebody was saying, the role of women in China in the interwar period. So there's a kind of playing element going on there. In Hungary, from what I can tell, there's a good side to history teaching and a bad side. The good side to history teaching is that it actually gives you a textbook. And a lot of people don't like textbooks anymore. But at least these textbooks give you a structure. You can either run with it, you can react against it, but it gives you a sense of chronology, and it gives you certain important facts. And that is something I like about Hungarian history teaching. What I don't like about Hungarian history teaching is that they don't encourage critical discussion of the textbook. Because the best and the most balanced your teaching is, here's a textbook, this is what it says, what do you think about this? What's your interpretation about that? In other words, a good Hungarian orientation towards history teaching would really force students to open their mouth, to give their opinion, to defend their ideas, and in the course of that, to really genuinely assimilate what those historical facts are all about. Just as an aside. Now, what I think comes out of today for me is the importance for us to take ourselves seriously. If we genuinely believe that history matters, that history is really important, and if we really think that defending our past matters, then it's really important that we step up a little bit. And I myself think that there is a culture war that's going on. And I think in the culture war, the level of discussion is very, very low. I mean, I get really, really worried about this. I was talking to a colleague at Harvard University. And Harvard, you got to remember, is one of the best universities in the United States. And we're just talking about our experiences. And he makes the point that he's staying in Harvard as a sacrifice to the discipline. Right? He's not in Harvard for pleasure or for the money he's getting, but he thinks that it is very important that there are at least some serious historians that remain within the academy. And there are less and less people within the academy in many parts of the world. I think some parts of the world are blessed, like I think England's got a larger cohort of serious intellectuals who are genuine historians than in some other places, but that's just an accident. And I think the lesson for me is we got to undertake the project of taking our ideas more seriously and developing a dialogue amongst ourselves that is not complacent, open to new experience, yield to new experience, where we question ourselves as much as we question the other side, so that we can begin to somehow create a genuine intellectual revolution in relation to this. think our second task is the training of young people. The thing that I'm most proud of in my very, very long life is that I've trained around 50, just over 50 PhD students. And many of these PhD students have gone on to become professors, lecturers, serious thinkers. And when I think of, if I'm going to drop dead tomorrow, and I'm going to ask myself, what is it that you achieved? It wouldn't be my books. It wouldn't be my paintings or anything like that. What it would be is the fact that there are individuals, intellectuals, who independently got the moral resources, the intellectual resources to run with things. And we got to do that. We almost got to create what I call a situation of Gramsci in reverse, right? Gramsci talked about his intellectuals that he wants to create to challenge the hegemony of what he saw as bourgeois society. We got to create a group of intellectuals that can challenge the cultural elites and the cultural sort of institutions that dominate our lives, that are capable of doing that in a fairly sort of systematic way. I think that's really one of the most exciting things that we can do at this stage in time. And finally, this is the conclusion that I come to through hard struggle, because it's very difficult to achieve. We got to think about building new institutions. Right? I don't think that you can reform history teaching in large parts of the world. The teacher training colleges in the United States are a mess. I mean, it's an embarrassment to the idea of teacher training, because what they are doing is they're creating indoctrination factories. So we have got to get to the point where we can create our own institutions, at least a few, to demonstrate to the other institutions, what an old-fashioned, liberal education is like. What an institution is like that's capable of engaging with the values of the Renaissance or the Enlightenment and all these other important developments in our history. So that's something that we all got to begin to think about, how we address that. And I know you cannot do it everywhere, but we need to have at least a few institutions here and there that can act as beacons of what could become a genuine intellectual renaissance, which is desperately needed within European societies. So I urge all of you after this to have a talk to each other, see whether you can cooperate, and maybe what we can also do is to create a network of academic historians or genuine historians from different countries that can begin to sit around and think together how we develop our own way of dealing with this. I know in England this is being done by History Reclaimed, which is really an excellent, probably the most important initiative in that respect. But we need to do something on an all-European basis, where essentially we discuss the tactics, the strategy of how we can basically change the intellectual milieu that prevails at the moment. So thank you for coming. I'm delighted for one reason and one reason alone, that I've learned a lot today. And I cannot always say that that's the case, but certainly I've really learned a lot, and I hope that we can have similar discussions, maybe even more debate, maybe more argument than is the case at the moment. So, have you got wine, by the way, or anything like that? Okay. So, drinking wine is the logical next step to a discussion of history.